Okay, so we're going to get started. I'll apologize in advance. I managed to get sick on Thursday and lost my voice for the bulk of the weekend, and it's kind of back, but not really. So it's going to be whatever it's going to be, and I'm going to sound a little funky, but it is what it is. We don't have enough class days for me to just tell you to work all day because I have to get through enough stuff before the end of the semester. So as of today, you're entering your last 2 weeks for the final. Time to panic, right? But because we're rapidly approaching the final, I think it makes sense to come back and talk about portfolios again. Remember, you should be working on them along the way. Hopefully it's not a big panic at the end. I've been reminding you of it. I put all the portfolio examples in the back for today so you guys can look at them. A lot of you have already been doing that, which is perfect. And you obviously should be well on your way of creating your layouts and that sort of thing. It's now time to put all of your work to date into that portfolio and start kind of polishing it up a little bit. Today I want to talk about covers and cover design. What do you put on the cover and that sort of thing, because I think it's relevant to at least introduce that as not an afterthought. Remember, the portfolio cover is the first thing that somebody sees about your portfolio. It's the first impression that they have of your work before they even open it. So it's really important to think about what that cover looks like. So what, maybe, nothing. Everything has not worked today. So just that's the way it's working. Yeah. There we go. So what belongs on the cover? Number one, you absolutely have to have your name on the cover. It makes no sense to have a portfolio that doesn't have your name on the cover. This is a body of work about you. You need to own it. So it needs to have your name on it. Then we move into the optional section. So you absolutely have to have your name on it. And then different people have different ways of describing it. I'll show you a bunch of examples today that'll talk through it. But sometimes it's your name portfolio. Sometimes it's design portfolio. Sometimes it's architecture portfolio. Sometimes it's selected works. It's all kind of the same thing. Sometimes, if you're applying for something specific, like let's say you're going back to grad school and you're applying to Berkeley for the master's program, you have to, by their definition, put on there you're an option 2 candidate or an option 3 candidate or whatever you are. So sometimes there is an additional layer of information that you have to put on there that's mandated by whatever you're using the portfolio for. In today's, for the class, for your final project in this, however you choose to designate it is fine. But a lot of times that's added. And then sometimes people choose a date range or a year as a way of saying, this is my portfolio for 2017. And then maybe you have a different one for 2018 that includes different work. It's a way of making a volume out of it. Sometimes you say, this is 2005 to 2017. This is all my work, or whatever it is. So you have a date range that identifies what's in this particular booklet of information. So let's look at some examples. So the first general category of portfolio covers is the text-only category. So all we're going to see is a blank page with some text. And they can be very effective. Doesn't take much. I guess technically this one has a little bit of a logo to it. But essentially this is text. The two things that I talked about are on it. The name has to be there. It says architecture portfolio. Relatively simple. In this context, it's centered in the page, but right justified, so it's a little bit different in that context. And I think it's pretty well done. About as simple as it gets. Name, interior architect. That's it. Subtly done, tying the red lettering together with the inner cover, which is certainly an option in terms of how you construct the book itself. One of the things that's really critical about just a type cover is the font choice. Font weight, font thickness, all that typography lesson that we were talking about way back in, what was it, 114-ish, somewhere in there. It all matters. What font you choose matters. So you want to think very carefully about it. Another example here, name, interior design. They've got a little bit of a signature. I would only put a signature on if your signature is really cool. I don't think mine's cool enough, so I would never do it. So you want to really think about, does it belong? Hers happens to be pretty cool. and it works nicely graphically as part of that cover. So certainly something to think about as part of it. Different style, still all text, right? A little bit of logo there, but essentially this is about font choice. It's a very thin, all lowercase. Look at it. There's a little bit of additional information down in the corner. I don't know whether that's important to include. I would argue that phone and email go on the next page, go on that interior page, but it's up to you. Very small text architecture portfolio. I don't know whether small text is a good thing in this context. It is an architecture portfolio. It's worth mentioning that it is an architecture portfolio. This would work nicely with an interior layout. Remember, we've got that nice, strong column division, content on the left, text on the right. You could use that throughout as a layout technique. Architecture folio, etc. So then we take the text and we fold in some kind of an abstract background. And again, this is a personal preference, and it should reflect your particular style of work or your particular ideals. And it's not something that just because I show one over the other means you should do one over the other. So you really have to think about what matches you. So if you're a text-only person, that's perfectly fine. I happen to be a text-only person. That was how my portfolio was when I applied to grad school. So it's something that you have to think through in terms of what do you want to see. Different example here, abstract. I mean, I guess technically this is a photograph of a model, but it's reading as abstract. We can't necessarily read this as architecture. Maybe, maybe not. Told you, this is my day. There we go. Nope, now we're going to skip ahead. Abstract background, some kind of a form, some kind of triangulated mesh, doesn't really mean anything. The cover of the book, the architecture book for this class, the Digital Tools for Architects Handbook, it's totally abstract. Okay? So this is certainly a strategy. I would argue that this text is a little bit heavy-handed for the portfolio. It's a little bit large and a little bit heavy-handed for the cover. Graphic background, the ink splats with this cut out. Obviously, this person's pretty good at Illustrator and masking and that sort of thing. I really don't like the way that they put the name on this little right there. The little bit of shadowing or whatever, it just looks so fake. And so if you're going to go after something like this where you want it to have that three-dimensional quality as if you'd like drew it and splattered it, it was whatever, make sure that you don't do some kind of corny drop shadow. It just doesn't fit. Okay? So think carefully about those kinds of things. I have no idea who that person was, so if you're listening, I apologize. I really like this one. It's completely abstract background. It's different than the basic white background, but it reads kind of like just a colored background. It's a little bit more than that, this brushed aluminum look. I think the font choice is really nice. The challenge with this kind of a font is that it's so thin when you go to print it, unless your printer is really good, it's going to tend to blur together and you're going to lose it against the background because it's so thin. So it works nice on a screen. If you go to print it, I'm a little less convinced. I think you need a little bit more thickness to really have it stand out. Another example here on the cork backdrop. To me, I get portfolio. I get how they put the graphics together on this, except I think it's really hard to read. And it's kind of distracting. If those three stacked circles repeated through the whole body of work, maybe it would work out as a theme. But I'm not convinced just by the cover. Another example here, this is a common strategy. You take some piece of work, a floor plan or whatever, and you fade it out into the background with your name over the top of it. You have to be careful on this sort of thing that the background doesn't dominate the text so that you lose the text. I would argue that this person's last name down there starts to get a little bit too close to the background color. It's a little hard to distinguish. Remember, this is entirely about your work and making you stand out. This one's pretty nicely done. It's printed on an actual metal. So sometimes people get creative with how they create it, their portfolios. And in this case, it's a sheet of metal, and it's either die-cut sticker or painted right onto it. But obviously, that's a different and unique background. Another example here, this one happens to be cut out. And I think I show more cutouts in a little bit later. It's cut out acrylic. Okay, here's another one, abstract kind of tiled background. I think this one works really nicely. The background works nicely. It's established kind of on a rule of thirds basis, but I have to point out that all the details matter, and the fact that those two don't line up is a glaring hole. Remember, this is the first thing that somebody's going to look at about your work. If you make a mistake like this, where those things don't line up, that's the first impression that they have of you, right? That you're being careless, you're not going to look at those particular details, and they're going to put your portfolio aside and pick up somebody else's. So you really have to think about those little tiny details. Is the font spacing, kerning, justification, is it all correct? Does it feel right? And again, if that was your portfolio, I'm sorry. The photographic background, this one's kind of a hybrid between the photograph and the abstract background. It's a concrete wall. It's pushing more toward the abstract, so I include it in this part. Portfolio, name, etc. falls nicely on this as a body of work. This one, much easier to read on this screen than it is on that screen. It gets washed out. This is more of like a urban design person, so they're doing more of like a city planning diagram, background, that sort of thing. Reads nicely. It's kind of a unique one. I don't know, it's different. Not quite sure why you need a barcode on your portfolio, but why not? This one's a very popular one. The cityscape that somehow ties as a silhouette. Yeah, I've seen it done. I've seen it done in the back there on some of the example ones. It works nicely. A little bit of graphic background, and it's done in a variety of ways. Again, font choice, think about how they work together. What's positive, what's negative space can be very advantageous. Alex Holgraf, remember, we've seen his work before, we've seen his portfolios before, but I like to point out his covers. If you go online and you go to his website, he has a bunch of tutorials about his workflow relating to portfolios and thinking about covers. He recently published his volume 4 of his portfolios. If you go, you can see he has an article on designing the cover for volume 4, and he has about 10 or 12 different versions of the cover that you can look through that show you that with the same content, you can really vary what the overall look and feel of this particular book looks like. So it's definitely something worth thinking about. Do some browsing, and that'll help you. This is the unfolded version. Remember, there is a front and a back, and then you can wrap the cover all the way around. So sometimes that's an advantage too. And you have to think about how are you displaying it from the back. So then we move into the text, and then there's some kind of a work or a project background. It's something that identifies you, that's really good about you, and you want to show that on the cover. Maybe you're good at drawing, so you want to include a little bit of that drawing on your cover. Maybe you're really good at rendering, you want to include a little bit of that on it. And you have to kind of think through what represents you. So this is a pretty classic example, the little sketch. Little sketch version, portfolio, really nicely done, great typography, and a really, really nice sketch. Now, if you're not good at sketching, this isn't going to shine. It's not going to look great. So you can only do this if you're really good at this kind of drawing. Does that make sense? The last thing that you would want is to show something you're not good at. If you're not good at sketching, you put a sketch on the cover, it doesn't match. So one of the things about a portfolio, and I'll tell this story because I think it can help identify why a portfolio is important and why showing your work in a certain light is important. There were 2 students that came out of DVC, and this is a while back, so the circumstances will be slightly different for you. There were 2 students that came out of DVC. This is probably 2009 or something like that. They both got into Berkeley, and they went to Berkeley. And they showed up on the first day for 100A. One student had worked really hard and created a nice quality portfolio of his work. He was interested in a lot of digital fabrication techniques and that kind of representation, 3D modeling, and that sort of thing. So his portfolio had a lot of that content in it. The other student, who was also a very good student, they were both A students here. The other student didn't really work on his portfolio. And at the last minute, he said, I'm going to throw together a portfolio of work. And he happened to throw in a lot of freehand drawing. He thought his drawings were pretty good, and he threw in the freehand drawings. So they showed up at 100A on the first day, and the professors of 100A said, let me see your portfolios. And so they got out their portfolios to see. Well, they looked at the work, and they had to decide which section of 100A. Remember, here at DVC, we have a small, you're in 220, and it might be a class of 20 to 30 to 40 people, something like that. At DVC, design studio is maybe 100 people, and you're broken from there into groups of 12 to 15. So there's lots of different subsets of the main design studio. And so you have to get put into this subset. So they look at those two portfolios. The student who did the hand drawings was interested in the same kind of 3D stuff. But did he get put in the 3D advanced studio? No. He got put in the hand drawing studio. So he got to spend a whole semester hand drawing. And that really wasn't what he was interested in. The other student got put in Lisa Iwamoto's section, who is like on the forefront of this kind of digital fabrication and that sort of thing, and got to be in her studio. So how you choose to represent your work is absolutely critical to the path you're going to take, or the path that you want to be on. So if you're interested in sketching, and you're interested in this quality of work, that's what you show. Does that make sense? So it's really important to think about what that is. And, of course, for this class, I have requirements. You have to put all your assignments in. If you were going to go take this portfolio to Berkeley and show it to them, feel free to cut out the assignments you didn't like. Right? Of course, I have to tell you to do it because it's part of the class. But remember, you can always edit things out of the portfolio. Just because it's in there right now doesn't mean it has to stay. So another example here with kind of a little light rendering. This person was interested in light studies, and that makes sense. I think this one's really nicely conceived as an overall cover. It's abstract. It's clearly about rendering light. It has this kind of model drawing quality to it. The text is nicely done. It reads well. It shows well. Another example here. This one's it's hard to see on the screen, but it's an oversaturated image with kind of this red background. Yeah.
So I was going to ask. So if I have a lot of work that's like more of a white background, would I necessarily want to go super dark on my cover? I feel like they're kind of misplaced.
Yeah. It's again, portfolios are kind of a personal preference. For me personally, to answer your question, I would go with a white cover or predominantly white cover. I wouldn't want the contrast. I would want it to kind of go together as a body of work. I'm partial. When I did my portfolio for grad school, it was a white cover. It's just there's a certain cleanliness about it. Some people really like the black background, or they really like the oversaturated kind of colors. And if that's you, then you own that, and that represents you. So in your case, I'd say probably a white cover makes more sense. But you have to think about it. Try a few options and see. Some people, and you'll see in the back, and we'll do cutouts in just a second, make them out of thicker paper, and they do cutouts and those kinds of things. Some people like black, some people like white. Just depends. Another example here, the overlays, the trace, kind of the working process. It's a really nice cover. But again, it shows where you're going to be going. And so you want to make sure that it matches up with what you're interested in doing. Great font choice, though. It reads really well. Another example here with kind of the photorealistic rendered background. Again, this person must be interested in that 3D modeling, rendering sort of thing. And that's not to say, by the way, that you couldn't have a portfolio with a bunch of 3D renderings in it and have a cover that just has text on the front. You don't have to do the rendered cover. You just want to think about what looks right to you. Another example here with kind of the digital drawing with a little bit of sketch overlay. I think it's a really nice drawing. It's nicely composed. The text is really nice. And then he put the scripted letters in. And it just kills it. Yeah.
About actually just the slide about we can do the sketch about the building. But right now, we're in the technology time. Why we don't use like the AutoCAD to build some kind of thing? Why still so many people like doing?
Why do they like the sketches so much? Well, sketching is kind of one of those, it's a weird thing because we're certainly in a technology time. We certainly do renderings and V-Ray and all of that sort of thing, yet there's a certain attraction to the old school hand drawing. And especially if you're interacting with people that are older, who have been in the architecture game longer. Let's say you're going to work for a firm and the principals of that firm are older, they went to school a longer time ago. They're going to respond to these beautiful sketches more than they are to a beautiful rendering because of their past and their track record. And they have an appreciation for what it is. I think it's unrealistic to think that, and I'm sure there are firms out there that still hand draw plan sets. I think that's, to put it bluntly, kind of idiotic in this stage of game. I think you need to be on the computer. I think it's expected that you'd be on the computer now. And most firms are going to be on the computer. But that doesn't mean that there isn't kind of a nice quality to sketching. Like there's not, that people like it. You know, there's a certain gestural-based, idea-based thing. And because of that, sometimes showing it in a portfolio can be a kind of an advantage. You get to see those things and that process and that thought process, and that can be good. If you show 100% polished, finished, rendered, perfect work all the time, the person that is evaluating your portfolio doesn't see anything into your process. They don't see how you work, just that you make pretty end results. And so sometimes, depending on what you're applying for, showing a little bit of process in conjunction with a really nice high-quality render might be the best strategy for really showing you as a whole. So you get little tidbits of kind of your process. Does that make sense? Somebody else had a question. The process? No? So more examples. So this is with a physical model background. If you're really good at model making, and actually it segues nicely. You asked about sketching. Model making is the same thing. We've gotten to the point where models are more undervalued than they ever used to be. You guys, a lot of you were in 121 and you just had to build the Mondrian Museum, correct? Is model making a lot of work? Yeah, it's a huge amount of work to go through, especially when you don't use a laser cutter. And so there is definitely, if you're good at it and you can make beautiful models, there's a certain quality to it. No matter how good anything else that you do is, if you come in with a beautiful model, you're going to get good feedback. There's something about a model that you just can't replicate on a computer. You can see different views, you can look at it differently. So if you're really good at making models, showing the models is a good place to go. Right? So this is the very 3D full color, but it's on a nice white backdrop. So it still works nicely. Then we get into the cutouts, and you'll see some of the cutouts in the back. You guys here at DVC have access to a laser cutter, so you can do things like this, where you cut something out of the cover or you engrave the cover. Way back when in this portfolio, I actually used to mandate that you do a laser cut cover, and I've gotten away from that because I think it's kind of overused. In the old days, 5 years ago, real old days, right? 5, 6 years ago, laser cutters were kind of new and innovative, so doing a laser cut cover was really cool. Now pretty much everybody took laser cutting in high school or something, so it's not as cool anymore. So if you choose to do it, you just want to do it well. This one's cut out of a nice acrylic, which is obviously nice. You have to think a lot about how the binding comes together if you're going to use something thicker than paper. So be aware that you have to solve the binding issues if it's thick. I have a bunch of examples in the back of laser cut covers. They can work really nicely, and they show really nicely. Binding options. So this is the other piece of the puzzle that you probably haven't considered just yet, is that you have to give me a physical version of your portfolio. It's not the online version. This is the one time where you're giving me something real. I'll ask you to post it too so that we have records of it. But you're going to give me something real. And because of that, you have to think about how you're going to attach the pages together to make them look nice. So the default thing that people do is they run to Staples or Office Max or Kinko's or whatever, and they say, can you bind this for me? Or can you print it, and then can you bind it? And so this is fine, but there are limited sets of options that are within this traditional. The first one is the spiral binding, which is very, very common. It's definitely something that you'll see in the back in the examples. It's cheap, which is good. Essentially, they drill a series of holes through your work, and then they run a piece of curling plastic through it. Okay? The problem here is if you have facing pages, if the book opens you get misalignments of flow lines because one is either higher or lower than the other because the spiral causes the second page to go higher or to go lower. Let me see if I can go in the back and find an actual example so you can see it. Okay, we'll pick Rebecca's here. Okay, so I open this like that. You can see this line right there doesn't match that line right there. They shift because the spiral causes one of the pages to go down as you open it. Okay, so it changes. If you do it where it's a one-sided book, it's less likely to see those issues. Let me see if I can. Are any of these one-sided? Yeah, something like this one. Okay, it's only one-sided. Every one of the pages opens. Doesn't matter that this one's up or down. Okay, so you want to think through that. Doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. It just means that it is something that actually happens. Yeah.
So which one's better, one page or two pages?
It's a good question. Is it better to have facing pages, spreads, or is it better to have single pages? The truth of that answer is it's going to be dependent on how much work you want to show and what the page limit is of the place you're applying. So if you are applying to grad school, for example, when I applied back in the Middle Ages to Berkeley, there was a limit of 12 pages. If you did spreads, you got 24 pages. If you did single pages, you got 12. I wanted the more space. I did them facing. Okay? So it's up to you. You just have to decide what feels right to you. Most of the time people do spreads, and most of the examples in the back are spreads. So I would say that spiral bindings are better for one-sided books than they are for two-sided books, and about a 1/4 inch of the page is going to get clipped in the middle. It's going to get all those holes drilled through it, so you're going to lose stuff in the middle of the binding. So you got to be prepared for some content to get lost. It's not a big deal if it runs through a photograph. Our brains can kind of interpret what's going on in those holes. If it's in the middle of a column of text, it's a really big pain because you can't read the text anymore. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to that. So there's a close-up of that spiral. It's cheap, it's plastic, such is life. Comb binding can be metal or it can be plastic. It kind of can be chunky. And so I have an example here, and you can see it there as well. These plastic ones are really thick, and they're just kind of heavy-handed. There are metal ones that are thinner. The advantage of a comb binding is that we don't have that shift page to page. They're always going to line up, right? As I open this, that's going to line up, that's going to line up. So there's no page shift, which is good for this style of book. Same thing happens, let's see here. I'm trying to point stuff out. Remember I was talking about that 1/4 inch text getting cut? It's really annoying when that happens. So you have to plan space for that binding. Okay? So there's no alignment issues, which is good, but it does again take about a 1/4 inch, for that, sorry. Takes about a 1/4 inch away. There it is in metal form. The metal tends to be a little bit more elegant than the plastic one. It's also not quite as rigid, but it's a little bit lighter weight. And again, it's cheaper and you can have somebody do it. There's another example of the metal. Another example of the metal there. Then we get into the handmade or the specialty. And so what I'm going to ask you guys to do when you turn in your portfolio 2 weeks from today, be scared, right? When you turn in your portfolio 2 weeks from today, I'm going to ask that you put a sticky note inside that tells me where you had it printed and what kind of binding it was, because people always come to me afterward and say, well, where'd they do this? It's like, well, I don't know. So I'm going to have you put it in there. Some of these have them. The older ones didn't. I got smart about 3 years ago and started putting those in. I am also going to ask you to put in how much it cost, because people like to know how much this particular book costs. Depending on if you go have it printed and trimmed at some professional shop or whether you do it here on the laser printers, the cost can range from, say, $5 to 30 or 40. It's just going to depend. And the quality is going to range as well. If you choose to bind by hand, your bindings can be very, very elegant and nice looking. And that's certainly an advantage. But it takes some work as to how to put them together. Glue, staples, hidden with little folds of paper, you can create a binding. If you think about it, you can come up with a nice, clean binding. And those can really look nice. Sometimes it takes a larger sheet of paper that you cut and fold around your body of work, or you glue it into place. I have had in the past a student actually sew the binding together with thread. And I have that one in the back so you guys can see it. Hers was one of the cheapest ones that was done. She ended up moving on to Berkeley. But I like to show it as an example because it reads very different than all the rest of it. So she has, there's her sticky note, right? This portfolio was printed in the school lab and cost about $5, right, on the low end. But if you look at this edge, number one, it's still together. This was quite a while ago, right? But it's kind of a lightweight binding. It doesn't feel heavy. As you open it, you get good, flow of her work across it. And it's very plain and simple. So there's nothing wrong with something like this. I used to have my grad school portfolio, and I don't know what happened to it. When I did that, I didn't want to see anything in the binding. So I put it together with staples along the binding. I flattened the staples so that they were perfectly flat, nothing stuck up. And then I cut a piece of watercolor paper that went over and kind of wrapped around the binding, and I glued the whole thing together. So it was a really nice, clean look. And so that's something that you can do as well. There are online print shops that do fancier bindings. You'll see some in the back are done with fancier bindings. You probably don't have time for the turnaround. And so that's something you have to kind of weigh as the option. So chances are you're going to be stuck with the simple ones at Kinko's, etc., or you're going to be stuck doing some kind of a handmade binding. And that's for you to decide. This is the last one, and that's where you print on a much larger sheet of paper, and then you staple or bind through the center, and the fold causes the booklet to come together. The difference here is you have to pay attention to your page order, because if you're printing on the backs and fronts of large sheets, the pages aren't necessarily in sequential order, so you have to vary your page order to get them to print correctly on something like this. Okay, so for the rest of today, I'm going to ask that you go back and think about your portfolio and keep working on it. You probably already have some pages laid out. If you haven't been working on it, you have a lot more content to put in that you haven't put in just yet. Remember, you need to include all of the assignments from this class as part of it, but you can also include your other work. A lot of you just did the Mondrian Museum. Include that. I mean, obviously, if it was good. I'm assuming it was good, right? You guys all aced it, right? Oh yeah, oh yeah. So you might want to include that. You might want to include other work. Maybe you want to include your Brise Soleil light study or whatever it is. Those are all good things to fill up your portfolio and to help show your body of work. Okay? So then you want to move on to designing your cover. Think about what I talked about in lecture today and what seems appropriate. Do you want just the text-based cover? Do you want some kind of background? You will have to have a cover for this work. Okay, that's inevitable. Given that information, probably starting to be time to work on it. So work on that. Then you're going to post your work, post the cover, or post some spreads. It's up to you. I just want a record for today. Are there any questions? Thanks for bearing with me with my voice, but I made it. All right? We'll see if I can make it through next class too.